right. Hello, everybody. It's really good to see so many people here. We've got 20 people here now, which is fantastic. And you all know we're doing an education session on physical activity and aging with spinal cord injury. We also all know that there's not a lot of research in these areas around aging with spinal cord injury. So I'm not sure if we can expect Jasmine to give us a ton of stuff about aging, but she's going to try to give us whatever she can, especially around physical activity guidelines and the questions that we generated 2 weeks ago. I've forwarded those to her, and if she doesn't hit them in her presentation, we can re-ask them afterwards, and we'll do the same thing that we did last time, in that we'll hold our questions till the end, if that's okay with everybody. And with that, I will introduce Jasmin, even though I think half of you already know her. She is an assistant professor at UBC School of Kinesiology. And then she's got a whole bunch more stuff in her resume that I can't really explain. So I'll let her explain some of it. I know it's the Move for All lab, and she's been a researcher, and she's been awarded for combining research with kinesiology, all sorts of things. So with that, I will let Jasmin do her thing, and then we'll ask questions when it's done.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Doug. Thank you for the warm welcome. And like I said, really nice to see so many familiar faces as well as some new faces. So I appreciate all of you taking the time out of your day today. As Duncan mentioned, you know, the evidence that we have in aging with a spinal cord injury in the area of physical activity, it's really a burgeoning area, we'll say. And so I'll do my best. But you know, at the crux of it is I love physical activity. And, you know, as Duncan mentioned, my lab is called the Movement for All Lab. I think physical activity is something that everyone can do. Sometimes it means that we get creative, but hopefully what we get to talk about today is talking about physical activity, not just in the exercise context of just, you know, we go to the gym, but expanding that definition, and also talk to a few of the considerations. You know, there are some, we have to get to the nitty-gritty of some safety things around exercising with a spinal cord injury and aging, and we'll do the best that I can to address those with the evidence that we do have. That being said, though, I know I've got a list of questions that are fantastic questions. I am going to save some of those, where I'm just going to pull off the presentation and just talk about it and get to show you some stuff on video, and maybe we all want to try some stuff too. But I also am happy to keep this sort of informal. If people want to jump in and ask questions along the way, I encourage that as well. So with that, our goals for today, whether we meet them or not, we'll see. But the hope is that we can talk a little bit about the physical activity guidelines. It's really sort of pulling together the evidence and what we have for how much is the minimum amount of physical activity we need to do to see benefits. And then I hope to also get a sense for you all too. You know, maybe we can engage in some conversation of what does physical activity mean to you. You know, when you come from the kinesiology world, sometimes we talk a lot about how it's really structured and we have to hit this intensity and we have to do this many minutes, and that is important. But at the end of the day, our body is just kind of like, oh, are you moving? Okay, that's good. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So I'm going to start here with what are the 24-hour movement guidelines. And I know that these are not the spinal cord injury specific guidelines. And I know many of you know that we have SCI specific physical activity guidelines. But the reason why I wanted to talk about these guidelines first is we have just so much more evidence to pull from. And so we talk about not just physical activity in these guidelines, but we also talk about sedentary time and sleep. These are really important, as I'm sure if anyone's had a bad sleep, right, the next day you're like, oh, am I really actually going to go and exercise? I'm pretty tired. And vice versa, where sometimes when we exercise, it helps us to sleep better. So thinking about these other behaviors beyond just physical activity and how they really interact with many of the other health behaviors that we have is important, so that we don't approach this in sort of a siloed view. So that's all to say is that these guidelines encourage us to sleep for 7 to 9 hours of good quality sleep. And good quality sleep means too is that, you know, we go to bed and we wake at similar times. That's sort of good, you know, what they call good sleep hygiene. You know, we have some days where we're better at it than others, but if we can try as best as we can to be consistent. And then the other piece here is around reducing sedentary time. And so when I'm talking about sedentary time, the definition that they have here is for able-bodied individuals. And so I like to expand that more broadly to sedentary time is time where we are inactive. It doesn't necessarily mean when we're sitting, but when we are inactive. And so it might be, you know, while we're watching TV. If you're like me, I spend a lot of time in front of the computer for work. So that is also sedentary time. And so ways in which we can break that up, you know, even if it means, okay, I'm going to take, you know, every hour or so, I'm going to take a break where I do some, watch a quick online video and do 5 minutes of movement. Or maybe it's that I go and, you know, go for a quick wheel to grab my tea or coffee. Just breaking up that time where we're not moving is also really important as a, you know, an independent predictor of our risk for chronic disease. So that's all I'm going to say about the 24-hour movement guidelines, because really we have these spinal cord injury specific physical activity guidelines that I think are so fantastic. If you look at these previous guidelines here, they'll tell you to get 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a week. So that means that would be movement where, you know, you could talk but not sing a song. That's that moderate intensity. And 150 minutes is a lot. When I look at and I ask my kinesiology students, so these students who are going to a university degree to study human movement, less than half of them meet these guidelines. So these are really guidelines that are sort of like the optimal levels. But what the SCI exercise guidelines or the physical activity guidelines tell us are the minimum threshold. So we have two sort of guidelines in these physical activity guidelines. One is our starting level. So these are if you want to see improvements in your, what they call cardiorespiratory fitness, which is to say your ability to be able to keep going for longer. So whether that's going for a wheel for longer, being able to keep up with your kids for longer, right? And so to be able to see those benefits, we need to do twice a week, 20 minutes at that moderate to vigorous intensity. So again, that's that intensity that, you know, I like one of our clients, you know, call it the huff and puff. So you're breathing a little bit heavier. You might be sweating above the level of injury. You know, you kind of have to focus a little bit harder, but you're still able to maintain a conversation, or you can push yourself further where it would be tough to, you know, have a conversation without having to take a breath every few seconds. But if we can at least hit moderate intensity, so talk but not sing a song, then that's a nice place to be. For strength training, you know, they have these guidelines here. It says 3 sets of 10 repetitions twice a week. I do agree that if we can get our strengthening activity, so that could be things like, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment, but it could be things like going to the gym and lifting weights. For some individuals, it could be things like, you know, even sometimes our groceries are heavy. So if you did that at a really dedicated session, maybe we can start to think of some more creative ways. But these 3 sets and 10 repetitions, while it is what we have in the evidence, I wouldn't say it's the be all end all. You know, if you're starting out, and I know in the more general literature, we can do 1 set and it doesn't have to be 10 repetitions. I'd say the key point here is when you're doing strength training and what we're starting to understand a little bit more, and this is beyond what we know in spinal cord injury, because we're just really sort of scratching the surface there, is so long as we're lifting or we're picking things up and putting them down at a weight and a number of times where at the end of it, you would say, oh, could I keep going forever? No, I think I probably only had a few more repetitions left in the tank. Then that's usually a good sign that we've put in some good work where we're going to see some benefits and adaptation, especially when we're first starting out. So just to summarize this first level here, if we can get out for, say, for example, a wheel for 20 minutes twice a week where we can talk but not sing a song, and if we could do some sort of strengthening twice a week where we've lifted weights that are either heavy enough or long enough that it felt like you were kind of nearing the end where we couldn't lift anymore, then that's a good sign too. So that's for our starting level. And even then, we don't have to start there. It might be a goal that we're looking to reach down the road. Sometimes we're looking for what can we do today if we're going from not having any history in physical activity, doing something is always better than nothing. So it might just be that maybe we're looking at incorporating once a week, and maybe it's to start with 10 minutes, and that's great. Now, the advanced level, we know that among people with spinal cord injury, we do see increased rates of chronic disease. So things like cardiovascular disease, which is the #1 leading cause of death, both for individuals with spinal cord injury as well as the general population. So if we're looking to prevent or decrease the risk for things like cardiovascular disease or diabetes, some more of these chronic conditions, then we have to hit something closer to 3 times a week at 30 minutes at that same intensity we last talked about. But the strengthening exercise guidelines stay the same. So taken all together, I always like to stress that guidelines are guidelines. It doesn't mean that you have to do exactly what they've prescribed here. But it does help us to see, okay, what's the minimum amount that I need to do to see what we have in terms of fitness benefits and some health benefits. And where you're at amongst those guidelines is really up to you. And I think importantly, when you're working with a health and exercise professional, we work hard to meet you with where you're at. And then maybe we progress to getting to these guidelines somewhere down the road, and who knows, in the future, maybe even exceeding. So those are the spinal cord injury physical activity guidelines. Now, if you're all here, it means that you probably are already drinking the Kool-Aid that we think that physical activity is important. And so just as a reminder, there's so many benefits. And there's all these things here, like these are some fancy words where when I talked about some of these chronic conditions, right, there are lots of health benefits, but when I talk to my clients, they're really interested in, can physical activity help pain? Yes. How about depression? Yes. Can it affect our mood in a positive way? Absolutely. Can it help us to decrease fatigue? You betcha. Same thing with spasticity and our function, that it helps us to be able to do our activities of daily living. So there are lots of reasons why physical activity is important. And beyond that, hopefully, if we're doing it in the right way, we also think that it's fun too. So to summarize this section and to get into a little bit more of what I want to talk about in this sort of second sort of objective of our time together, is to get at the point that physical activity, it doesn't have to happen in the gym. It doesn't have to have your special clothes and your special place. It's all about movement. So what do I mean by movement? So we have what's called leisure time physical activity, and we probably see some familiar faces in these photos here, but it's activity that you choose to do in your free time. So I do want to separate this from her rehabilitative exercise or rehab exercise that you might get from your physiotherapist. Those are really important, but these are separate. So beyond what you're doing for your rehabilitation. So I like to think of this sort of activity ramp where we've got some things that we can do to incorporate movement in our day-to-day that I like to call the everyday active. And then we can sort of move our way up the ramp into more competitive and sometimes higher intensity forms of movement. And I'll give some examples of that. So when we're talking about everyday active, you remember how I talked about those 24-hour movement guidelines and looking for those opportunities to decrease what we call sedentary time, or that time where we are inactive. And it could be that maybe it's stuff like, running errands, right? Being able to going to the grocery store, picking things up, putting them in the shopping cart, wheeling around, that all counts, right? Maybe it's that we've got our favorite Netflix show, and at the end of your Netflix show, it always gives you that little pause. Like, do you want to watch the next episode? Maybe before we come to that next episode, because it used to be relevant that I would talk about commercials, but we don't have commercials anymore. So, but in any case, right? Maybe there's some of those resistance band exercises, and I know that's one of the questions around resistance band exercise versus free weights that we'll talk about later. But we can do our resistance band exercises or range of motion exercises when we've got a break, for example, while we're watching TV, or if you've got a really heavy work day, or things that you're doing in front of the computer for a long time, like reading, then finding ways to break that up with, for example, your range of motion exercises or resistance band. And then there could just be things in your everyday. I had a client who said, well, I really like to dance with my kids. And you're just like, does that count? And yes, absolutely, that counts. So, finding ways that you can work in activities with your family, I think is really important, but also something that adds to our day is something that we look forward to and not something that we have to. So if we can find just the little things, right? Small changes that we can make in our day can make big differences. So then we move up our ramp to talk about more of what the physical activity guidelines are getting at. So those aerobic activities and our strengthening activities. And on the aerobic side of things, right, call it, if we can hit that moderate intensity, that's great. But there are lots of different things that we can do to get that aerobic sort of stimulus, or getting ourselves to do some of that huff and puff type of exercise. So it could be things like going for a wheel for fun. I know there's a great group, especially out in the Okanagan, that does quite a bit of hand cycling. And sometimes that can be a little more fun than, the arm ergometer if we're just, but maybe we also enjoy that, getting the opportunity to go to park. And many of the facilities that I know Marnie's here, they've done an environmental scan of all of the recreation centers that are outside of Vancouver proper and the South Fraser area. So many gyms are now also getting more accessible equipment like arm ergometers. We have so many great, I'm going to put another plug out there for Marnie, the Get Wild group, along with Park, who hold online Zumba classes or dance classes. And then of course there's sports. And oh my gosh, Marnie, like you should really just be giving this talk. Go and curl with the South Fraser Active Living group as well. So many opportunities here to get some more of that aerobic exercise. Now, on the muscle strengthening side, I get this question all the time, like, what is strength training? Like, what does that really mean? And really, our definition of strength training and muscle strengthening activity is, I think you're going to see it expand over the years. So right now, they usually talk about it as any sort of movement against resistance that serves the purpose of getting us stronger. And it can be that we use things like free weights. So for example, those dumbbells, and those can be really great because they can more similarly have us feel like what it's like to pick up objects in everyday life. There's a little bit more transferability than, say, for example, sometimes when you use a resistance band, very rarely does the movement feel like an elastic with the things that we pick up and put down on the day-to-day. But that's not to say that the resistance band exercise isn't important. What I'd say is the value add to resistance band exercise is that resistance band costs about, $5, for a strip of resistance band. Whereas free weights or machines can be thousands of dollars. So it just gives us the flexibility of things that we can do at home, more inexpensively to use things like resistance bands. But one isn't necessarily better than the other. You can still see a lot of really great benefits. Just depends on what you want to ultimately accomplish with it. The other thing that I mentioned is that I think we're going to start transitioning our ideas around what qualifies as muscle strengthening activities. If you've played sport, you know that there's definitely a strength component that's required to a lot of different sports. So, for example, specifically things like kayaking, rowing. We've got a great boxing class that runs out of Park as well, sometimes led by Leo Samarelli, and martial arts. So these are all things that sometimes, if we don't like going to the gym, but we like the idea of strengthening our muscles so that it allows us to improve our function and our activities of daily living. Sport can be a really great way to do that as well. So these are all what I like to say are like our planned activities that improve our fitness. They're the structured things that, we have a little bit more of a special place and a special time to do them. But I also want you to think about strength training doesn't have to be that hard. There is certainly an element where we can make it hard and we can make it complex. But I want to pitch you this. If you're thinking about doing muscle strengthening exercise, I want you to think about, I'm going to say 5 with an asterisk there, but 5 key movements. One is if you're pushing. So are you doing things like pushing like a door open, or pushing things up, for example, putting things away on the shelf when you come back to give groceries? So there's that push movement. Are you doing things to pull? So for example, if you like to garden, when you're pulling weeds out, that's your pull motion. Or I know some people like to swim, that's your pull motion. Squatting, if you are ambulatory or if you have lower body function, so our ability to get in and out of your chair. And likewise, for those who are ambulatory or have lower body function, having that hinge movement, which is our ability to be able to pick things up and off the ground. And then lastly, rotation and anti-rotation. So we're able to rotate our bodies. For example, if you had to put, say, your grandchild or a baby in the car seat in the car, that requires us to twist our bodies to do that. So if you can push, if you can pull, and for those who have lower body function, squat and hinge, and then rotate from side to side or resist those rotations when it's important, then you're going to be in a pretty good place for your strength training. I will add though, especially for our manual wheelchair users, shoulder exercises, and we can go through a bit of, if anyone's interested, we can go through some examples of that together if you'd like, but good shoulder health is absolutely paramount, so that we help to prevent our risk for overuse and chronic injury. So that's just an example here. These are different exercises that would kind of fall within those different categories. But like I said, just think about pushing, pulling, rotating, or resisting rotation, and then if applicable to you, squatting and hinging. So I already made the argument that, we've got examples like resistance bands, and that makes just strengthening equipment a little bit more accessible. But there's so many different options. I always say, like, if you're looking for heavy weights, just go to Costco. There's so many things that we have just at home, that we don't have to pay, extra money for. So things like filling a backpack, right? I know Marnie's group with the South Fraser Active Living group, with many of their exercise classes, you see, broomsticks, we see sweatband wrist cuffs that are tied to resistance bands if we don't have grip function. Sometimes we see things like water bottles with handles. And so lots of different things that we can do that are free or low cost without having to buy that fancy equipment. So the last area here that I'll just, I've got this in here, I'd say Duncan, is a great example of someone who has really leaned into the sporting world and has been really successful. And I know we've got, both of the Marnies here as well, lots of success in sport, and sport just gives you something special. And I know you all can speak to that, beyond just the fitness benefits, but there's this social aspect that comes with sport. So, basically any sport that you can think of, there is an adapted version, and sometimes it's just about getting creative and finding the right resources. But I've just highlighted some examples here in bold, of different opportunities that might be applicable, especially when thinking about aging with a spinal cord injury that might be appropriate. Anything from, we've got table tennis that happens regularly at park. I know that many of our swimming pools, across BC are accessible. And sometimes it means, we've got to call maybe Bert and Heather at the STIBC info line to find out exactly which ones. But opportunities for dance, which I'll share some resources with you as well. And then some of the ones that require some more special equipment. So getting able to get out and go hand cycling or sailing, for example. We've got the Disabilities Foundation that offers a lot of programming in adapted sailing. So all of these different ideas, really the world is your oyster, but sometimes it's about getting connected with the right people and getting access to the right resources, which we can certainly talk about more at the end. Okay, so hopefully, and I know many of you already have lots of experience in being physically active. I do just want to touch on, beyond what it is that we can do with physical activity. I also just want to talk around some of the safety issues and considerations that are specific to aging with a spinal cord injury in the physical activity context. So lots of things that we know about aging that are both similar among individuals with a spinal cord injury as well as those without. So first is that if you're an individual who is ambulatory, then we are, falls prevention strategies are certainly top of mind for us. And so ways in which we can prevent falls is to make sure that we have our strengthening exercises like we talked about, for example, our squatting and our hinging, doing some balance exercises. So doing things that move weight, for example, outside of where we're comfortable and requires us to readjust, change directions, perhaps it means we're moving from standing on both feet if we're ambulatory to single foot. And then power. So oftentimes when we are working with someone in the gym context, we're told to move weights slowly. And I want to make the argument that that shouldn't be the case always. It might be a good place to start, especially as we're learning technique. But power is really important for us to be able to sustain the activities that we need to do in activities of daily living. So power is to say that let's move that weight a little bit faster. Let's move those arms a little bit faster. And it allows us to do things like still being able to wheel up the hill or having to readjust if we are falling. Fractures are another area that we should be mindful of. And I'm sure your PT or your OT has hammered this into you around making smart transfers, not cheating in our transfers. Of course, strength training helps us to prevent or decrease our risk for fracture. Many of you will have already had an assessment for risk of fracture from your doctor. So being able to make sure that we understand there might be particular motions, especially if you've been diagnosed with osteoporosis in the spine, then we would avoid things like really deep spinal flexion. So really leaning forward with deep spinal flexion, likewise extensions. So extending backwards and then twisting, particularly if we are using loads or weight. We also know that as we age, we are at increased risk for dehydration. So the long and the short of it is just make sure that you're drinking enough water. In terms of our unique considerations in aging with a spinal cord injury is we might also be at risk for increased risk for lung infection. So that's to say that we might have more difficulty in clearing secretions. This is a great opportunity to visit your physiotherapist. GF Strong offers, for example, free lung volume recruitment bags, and they can give you education and assistance with what's called breath stacking, which is basically where you'll breathe in, and then they've got this sort of attachment that's a one-way valve, so it kind of doesn't allow you to breathe out. And then they keep adding air to help expand those lungs, and then you remove the attachment and breathe out. So it allows you to be able to expand. And I'm sure many of you have tried that before, but could just be a strategy to be mindful of with the increased risk for lung infections. As I mentioned before, we also see an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. So a lot of the typical things and having your regular checkups with your doctor, but also to know that cardiovascular disease is highly modifiable in terms of our risk and management. And using lifestyle behaviors. So that's that physical activity and diet as examples. And then this would be no surprise to you, but the increased risk for overuse injuries, particularly in our shoulders, our elbows, and our wrists. But strengthening can also help to prevent those overuse injuries as well. And then the last thing that I'll talk about here is related to posture. So this definitely falls within the realm of your PT and OTs, making sure that you're going in for regular seating assessments. But strength training can also help with some of that posture. So I'm always mindful that, if you're an individual who does use a manual wheelchair, that's a lot of push motion that we talked about. So if we can program more pulling motion into our program, so the things that look like pulling weeds out of the ground, then that can help to balance some of our musculature. So the last thing that I'll leave you with here are some resources. Duncan and I had a really cool collaboration this year where, Duncan said to us, we need more resources. and this is part of where this presentation came about. We need more resources. We already know that there's not a whole lot out there, but let's pull together what we do have. And I've got a group of 60 amazing kinesiology students that worked hard to pull together a set of resources that are specific to aging with a spinal cord injury and being able to participate in physical activity. So I'll share just a few highlights, and I'm happy to share these slides and these links, whichever, Duncan, you probably got the best sense of how to share this stuff, but we have links for each of these. So,
well, I'll tell you what we do with each of these presentations is we record it and then we put it on our website.
Okay.
So it takes a little while to edit it and to clean it up, but then it goes on our website in the Aging with SCI section.
Great. Perfect. And so just, so these links are clickable. Maybe, we can pull those out and you can share it in an email as well in case anyone's interested to be able to click them. But as examples here, in terms of online exercise, so if you're looking for, videos or resources for what you can do online, the Shepherd Center has a really extensive list of particularly rehabilitation exercises, but maybe you've had an exercise that was prescribed to you by your physiotherapist or your kinesiologist, and you're like, I actually can't remember what that exercise looked like. No problem. We have a whole resource here of what those exercises look like, and features individuals with spinal cord injury exercising. My lab, as I mentioned, our Movement for All lab, our students every year have some sort of project. They put together resources. And so one of the things that they've done is they've compiled a list of BC specific physical activity options, both in person as well as online. And you can find that there. Park also does a great job where if you're able to come in person, fantastic. They've got fabulous in-person exercise classes, but something that they've maintained beyond COVID is their suite of online classes that are usually pretty well attended. There are, if you're interested in dance, I love to dance. So I put this one in here. So I'm putting a little bit of my bias in here. But another plug here for Marnie's group in the South Fraser Active Living group. They've got their Get Wild series. There's this resource here is from Cerebral Palsy BC, but they are also open to other physical disabilities, but they do free online dance classes. It's called Dance Without Limits. And then if you're looking for an in-person dance opportunity, there's the Fuse Wheelchair Dance that does their practices out of Park. In terms of getting social and getting outdoors, I cannot more strongly, that's instead of double negative, but I think the BC Moss group, in addition to the Disabilities Foundation, I should have listed those here as well. But if you're interested in, for example, doing things like kayaking or getting out on the trail rider, they've got a great set of staff that are well trained and a whole list of resources and equipment to do this, either at low cost or free. Tai Chi might also be another example, and many of the community centers across the different areas offer opportunities for Tai Chi. All Trails has a list of accessible trails if you're interested in getting outdoors. But if you need more assistance, like I said, you can connect with BC Moss to get hooked up with a trail rider. And then, of course, Marty, I'm here to just, talk about the South Fraser Active Living Group. But they've been really instrumental in looking at what are the opportunities, outside. Well, I've talked a lot about Park here today. Park isn't always the most accessible if you don't live in Vancouver proper. So they've done a lot of work and compiling some of the resources and creating those opportunities and events outside of Vancouver. So to tie this all together, right, movement is really what we're here for. We do have the guidelines, and guidelines are guidelines, but to remember that something is always better than nothing. Physical activity does not have to happen at the gym. It doesn't have to happen at the clinic, right? It can be with your grandkids dancing. It could be something that going out for a wheel, but find that thing that has you look forward to movement and not feel like it's something that is something that detracts or is something that you have to do. And like I said, it's just movement. Let's keep it simple. So that's everything that I have, in terms of structured presentation. I know I've also got a list here of questions that we have not addressed in the presentation, but happy to address some of these, but also I'll open it up here in case we want to have any other questions answered live.
Thank you, Jasmine. That was fantastic. I'm going to look in the chat room. Okay, there's a question here. When you say moderate intensity, what would a target heart rate be?
Oh, it's a great question. So Marnie, it's a little bit layered because it depends, because a heart rate is depending on where your level of injury is and whether it's affected your heart rate. The typical ways in which we calculate percentage heart rate does change. So let's say we took the example where you didn't have heart rate affected as a result of your spinal cord injury. Then we could say that you could, at a rough rudimentary level, take 220 minus your age, and that's your age predicted max heart rate. So let's say, just for simple math here, let's say I was 20 years old. I know I'm not, but let's say I was 20 years old, then my age predicted max heart rate would be 200. And then moderate intensity is usually around 50 to 70% of that. So it could be that if I'm hitting, 100 beats per minute, to 140 beats per minute, that might fall into that moderate intensity range if I was 20 years old. Now that gets more complicated because, well, you might have someone with a spinal cord injury who's 20 years old, but if you have a level at T6 and above, then your max heart rate might look something like 130. So the usual ways in which we calculate percent heart rate as an intensity, it changes with a spinal cord injury, and it depends. So I almost never use heart rate unless I've taken someone through, like, I know many of you have done research studies where you would have gone through and had your VO2 max test done. Like, if you remember that test where you basically keep going harder and harder until you literally can't go anymore. It's a terribly awful test. That can give you your max heart rate. And then we can use that to calculate what your intensity. So Marnie, you've done, I can't even count how many studies. You might have your heart rate, and you could use that to calculate what moderate is for you. But otherwise,
Jasmin, I'm really glad you mentioned T6 and above, because I was going to mention it too.
Yeah.
In that, being from wheelchair rugby, everybody that plays wheelchair rugby are quadriplegics, mostly, unless they're incomplete. And the heart rate issue is very, very interesting. There was a lot of research done on it, and the predictions have changed. Like, it used to be that they would say that you could barely get your heart rate up to 100 if you're lucky. But then there were rugby players that were getting it up to 130. So now I'm not really sure, but I think what you would do is just take your max heart rate, if you know it, and work out a percentage to get it up to. So I think mine is around 80. And if I can get it to like 90, I think I'm doing some good work. I'm not sure if that's right or not. Jasmin can correct me, but that's kind of where I go.
Yeah. And I think that's so much of how we prescribe exercise is like working with what works for you as an individual. Like, I think that's so hard sometimes, some of the guidelines we have around exercise, and especially related to intensity. It's so much dependent on the individual. And I also, like, they're the things that you could do to measure your heart rate, and it'll tell you, okay, this could be, for you, Duncan, if we know that your max heart rate is X, and then we hit this, beats per minute, then that means that you're at this moderate intensity. But we also know that, how you feel in the day-to-day really fluctuates. So what our heart rate is telling us, and also how, like, our perceptions of how we're feeling on that day can also have impact on how we're performing. So yeah, I sort of weigh that as, I oftentimes will use my warm-up, or with my clients, I'll use warm-up as, okay, to kind of assess, like, how are we feeling today? If today is a good day, great, and we've worked ourselves up, then we can aim for some more of that vigorous intensity. Like, some of that would be able, talking would be hard. You'd have to take a breath every few words. But if today's not your day, and maybe you're experiencing a lot of pain and fatigue, then let's not aim for moderate, vigorous intensity, but let's just do what we can. Something is better than nothing. That for me is, I think, just, one of the most important messages that I try to share around intensity is, like, be kind to yourself, meet yourself with where you're at, capitalize on those days where you do feel good. But be kind to yourself on those days where maybe the focus is, let's just get movement. Something is better than nothing in our day.
Yeah, I got another chat question, which is very interesting. Most of us probably have shoulder injuries. When exercising, how do we know what is too much exercise? Do we just go until it hurts? What if it hurts as soon as you start exercising? So there's about 3 questions in there, but it's a common one. Shoulder injuries are definitely a common concern.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll preface this by saying that, I can also acknowledge that some people also just live with a baseline level of pain. So it is going to be relative. I can't really give you a number per se to say, okay, a 6 out of 10 is it's too much pain, or a 4 out of 10 is too much pain. We can say that generally, but it really depends on the individual. But I'd say the best strategy that you have is your monitoring. So if you know what your pain typically feels like, and so assessing before, or asking yourself before you start the exercise, during the exercise, and then really importantly after the exercise, you want to be seeing that we're not seeing increases. So if, for example, you started out and we start doing these shoulder exercises and your pain is usually a 1 out of 10, you do the exercise and it's a 3 out of 10. And then, the next day that pain persists or it got worse, that's usually a sign that we did something wrong. So it's monitoring to see, have things gotten worse is one of the things that we're looking for. The second thing is also in your preparation. So, Duncan, as you mentioned, many people have shoulder pain and you're going to go through an exercise and oftentimes feel that pain. So can we put ourselves in the best position to assess whether today is a good day or not? And part of that comes in with a good warm-up. Because if we start cold, many times we are going to feel that pain and it's not going to get better until we get warm. And even then, sometimes it doesn't. But if we can put ourselves in the best position, and so that's to say, I think about 4 things when I'm warming up. First is, it's like there's an acronym, it's called RAMP. So the first bit is raise. The R is raise. Can you raise your heart rate? So it could be that, for example, if I look at some of Marnie's classes, you start with dance to get warm. So it could be if you're at the gym, maybe you're starting with going on the arm bike or the ski ergometer, right? Doing things to get your heart pumping, get the blood flowing. And if we can get warmth to the tissues, it's kind of like muscle or rather like metal, or like if you took like a wire, when it's heated, it's much more pliable, but when it's cold, you're like, ooh, that's stiff. We're not moving, right? Our muscles kind of feel that same way. So the first thing is there is that ramp. So, or rather the raise, can we increase our heart rate and get blood flowing to the tissues? The second thing is, can we start to activate and mobilize? So if we can go through as much available range of motion that we have. So for example, if we're talking about the shoulder, right? We've gone through, let's say we did our raise, we did our arm cycling and we're feeling good, we're feeling warm. How much range of motion do we have? So working with your shoulder, how much rotation can I get this way? How much rotation can I get that way? How high can I reach? Okay. How much can I rotate my arm outwards? How can I rotate my arm inwards? Right? And so going through those different ranges of motion allows you to also see what is typical for you, how we're moving today, but also aligns with that principle is if we don't use it, we lose it. So you want to go through your full available, tolerable range of motion as often as possible so we don't lose it. And then the last bit there is around potentiating. So potentiating is to say that we slowly increase the intensity. So when you start your workout, like don't go in and bang the full stack. You're like, yeah, feeling great today. Like, no, let's start with some lighter weights and we can do increased, a greater number of repetitions, and that's okay. But let's work towards and slowly, gradually increase the weight or the intensity so that we don't then cause further damage. So this question around pain, Joan, I'm sorry, I did not give you a short answer because it's layered and complicated. And to summarize all of that, one is, can we monitor? So what's our normal pain? Are we seeing that it's changing before, during, and after? And if we are seeing increased pain for the after, then it's usually a sign that we need to change something for next time. And then 2, are we doing a good warm-up so that we put ourselves in the best position to appraise that pain? Did we do things that made our muscles warm, go through our full available and tolerable range of motion, and then did we slowly increase the intensity?
Okay, thank
That was a
you.
mouthful.
Oh, I'm sure it was. There's one more question here. Well, there's another question here that says, who can access PARC and
Yes.
how I am ambulatory with an SCI? Well,
Yes.
Jasmin, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. So PARC is highly recommend and is also available for individuals with an SCI who are ambulatory. It starts by, if you just check out their website, and maybe I can multitask, but I'll put their website in the chat. And they'll send you a form. You do need to have physician clearance to start at PARC, but they'll give you all that information to be able to sign up. But it is free, and I highly recommend it. We have many of our students who volunteer or work there as support. It's just an awesome community, whether you're there for the social, but also for the exercise. But if you
I can
take
interject there and say it's a very welcoming place. The
Mhm.
students are fantastic. They will help you if you need help to access any of the equipment. They'll help you. So it's really a good spot. It's got really good equipment.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, it's the only it's the only spot in BC that has that much equipment.
Yeah.
I know that UBC Okanagan has some, but you have to be
Yep.
participating in research to use it. And then there's another place in Victoria called Move. And it's another place for people with disabilities. I'm not sure where it is, but I know they have some equipment because I did a little research on it a couple of months ago. So they have some good equipment there too, and that's in Victoria. Those
Mhm.
are the ones that I know about. And there's probably more. I think your best bet would be to talk to your SCI peer support person in your area to see if they know what's available.
And I think I
Sorry.
saw there was Heather Lamb here too, right? If you call the SCIBC info line, like I call them, I used to call them all the time. Heather and Bert, like I must have had them on speed dial. They've also got lots of great information and they've got their 1-800 number.
The SCI info line, and they know an awful lot of stuff.
Yes, they
So
do.
they might know what's accessible or where, or if anything's accessible in the area that you're in.
Mm-hmm.
That could be very, very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
We'll put a plug in for them. Now, the other question that isn't in the chat line, but was one of the questions that was forwarded to you, and I can't remember if we actually addressed it or not,
Mm-hmm.
was the difference between, oh, no. The question I'm thinking of is, what do we do to increase or maintain the musculature that's necessary to maintain our transfers?
Mm. Yeah.
Which is, without knowing what those transfers are, is a bit difficult, but at the same time, there's certain things that are absolutely necessary to do any transfer.
Yeah. So let's just say that we were going with basic transfer. And so in any case where I have this question of like, how can I, strength training for X movement, I try and break it down. So if we're doing something like transferring, a lot of times there's something where we're supporting, we're having to push and slide ourselves. So if you break that down into the muscles that are required, right? We've got things like our lat muscles. So those are our back muscles that are really important for pulling, kind of like the stuff that you get, like, if you were, like a big muscle that you use for swimming, for example. The other muscles that are involved, there's this push aspect. So your triceps are really important. So the backs of your arm. And then oftentimes too, in that support is you are also pushing. So that pushing movement here also comes a lot from that pec. And then of course your shoulder stability, which comes into your rotator cuff muscles. So what that's to say is if we can target things that you can feel the backs of your arms, the front of your chest, your back kind of along the sides there and backwards. And then these muscles that kind of come across the back here. So your rotator cuff muscles, which comes with your internal and external rotation sort of exercises. If you hit those types of things, then you're in a pretty good spot. You can also just simulate the movement. So for example, if you're at Park, they have the tricep dip machine. And so it's kind of set up. This is so awkward on Zoom, so sorry. Right? You kind of have these bars here and you push those bars down, right? That's a really good example of something that just looks very similar to the transfer movement. So it's kind of just looking at what does that movement look like? Can you recreate it in the gym? And then, if that stuff all doesn't make sense and you're like, geez, that sounds complicated, then sometimes it means that being paired with an exercise professional could be helpful. Yeah.
I think I want to throw something in there as the other thing to do is to avoid tricky transfers as often as you
Yes.
can.
Yeah.
A transfer that makes you move your arm in a way that's not really how it should be moved is putting you at risk, basically. If you're doing, especially when you're getting in and out of cars or in and out of tubs, things like that, you need to make sure that you're not reaching too far to do that transfer. And there's little things you can do in your car. There's a little fold down pad that you can get that makes it so that you can just transfer onto the pad and then into the car. So you don't have to reach that far. But those kinds of things you got to really watch as you get older. You got to watch the tricky transfer. I know when you're young, and when I was young, I figured I could do anything and did most of the time. But you know, now when you do something like that, it might hurt. So you got to be very careful. And the damage can be, it can be serious. Okay.
Yeah, and I want to add to that, Duncan. I think you bring up such a great point around tricky transfers, and just to emphasize the risk associated with them, especially in aging with the spinal cord injury. So we know that when we're young, we recover pretty well from an injury. And what oftentimes happens when you are injured, so let's say, for example, you did a risky transfer and you ended up injuring your shoulder. What oftentimes then happens is then you're unable to use that shoulder to its full function. But what's happening at that same time is many of us will go through what's called sarcopenia, which is this decline in our muscle mass and strength that at some point can get to the point where we're no longer able to maintain that independence. Not as much of a big deal when we're young, but when we are older, how we recover from time taken away where we are not using the muscles is much more challenging. And sometimes people don't get back up to that same level of function and strength as where they were before their injury. So that's all to say is, you know, when you're weighing the cost benefit of that risky transfer, just to know that the consequences of that and the time course for being able to rehabilitate and regain that strength is much more challenging as we age.
I think a really good example was what Paul Clark brought up on the Tuesday that we were generating the questions, is that, you know, when he gets in and out of his hand cycle, he can't do the transfer the way he used to. So now he uses a bath seat in between. So he goes halfway.
Oh,
And
yeah.
those are kind of the things you got to look for, is ways you can, if you don't want to quit doing it, then you got to figure out a way to do it without putting yourself at risk.
Smart, Paul. I love that.
Okay. I'm looking at the time, and it is actually 5 to 2. I know Jasmin probably has to be somewhere at 2 o'clock. She runs in between things regularly. I want to thank you, Jasmin, very, very much. You did a great job, and I'm sure everybody appreciated it. And I want to just remind everybody, if you have more questions, send them to me, or maybe I can connect with Jasmin down the road and take a little more of her time if there's questions that haven't been answered for you. Send them to me and I'll try and deal with them. Our next educational session is going to be on pain. So I'm thinking that our next discussion group will talk about why you need to know about pain and what you need to know about pain. But while Jasmin's still here, I want to thank her again. And you did a great job, Jasmin. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Jasmin.
Yeah, great to see you all. Thanks so much for joining today. Have a great week,
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks for
Bye.
everybody that attended. Good job. And we'll
Thank
talk to you
you.
soon. Okay. Thank you.